It was a quiet Sunday morning, and the streets of the neighborhood looked calm and peaceful. Birds were singing, a few kids were playing in their yards, and the sun was just beginning to warm the pavement. Everything seemed normal. But for one man, it was anything but normal. He was behind the wheel of his Rolls-Royce, enjoying a rare moment of peace. The car gleamed under the sunlight, its polished black surface reflecting the houses on the street. He loved this car. It was not just a vehicle, it was a symbol of years of hard work and success. As he drove slowly, taking in the calm morning, he didn't notice the figure across the street. A young man, probably in his early 20s, leaned against a shiny black SUV. His posture was casual, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. There was something about him that felt off. The man in the Rolls-Royce didn't know it yet, but this young man, the son of one of the neighborhood's most notorious Karens, had been watching him for days. The man parked his Rolls-Royce near a small coffee shop he loved. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air as he stepped out. He adjusted his sunglasses and locked the car, feeling safe in the middle of the quiet street. He had no idea that the calmness around him was about to vanish in a few minutes. From across the street, the young man's lips curled into a small, almost invisible smile. He whispered something under his breath that no one could hear. Then, with deliberate steps, he started walking toward the Rolls-Royce. He wasn't running, not yet. He wanted to make his presence known. He wanted the man in the car to see him coming. As the young man approached, he made a few exaggerated gestures, pretending to be casual. But there was a tension in the air, a feeling that something bad was about to happen. The man who parked the Rolls-Royce noticed him finally. He frowned. Something about this guy looked familiar. Maybe he had seen him in the neighborhood before. Maybe it was just a feeling. But he didn't have much time to think. "Good morning," the young man called out, his voice loud and confident. The man in the Rolls-Royce nodded politely. "Good morning," he replied. He tried to smile, but the tension didn't leave him. The young man stopped in front of the car, staring at it. His gaze was not friendly. He circled the car slowly, as if inspecting it, but with a hint of something dangerous in his eyes. The man behind the car noticed his growing unease. "What's your problem?" he asked carefully. The young man laughed, a short, sharp laugh that sounded more like a warning than amusement. "No problem," he said. "Just looking at your car. It's impressive." But the way he said it didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like a challenge. The man tried to brush it off. He didn't want trouble. He had dealt with many difficult people before, but something about this guy was different. There was arrogance in his eyes, a sense of entitlement, like he thought the world owed him something. Suddenly, the young man stepped closer to the car. His movements were slow, calculated. The man in the Rolls-Royce felt a chill run down his spine. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, every instinct was screaming that something was very wrong. The young man paused, looked directly at him, and smirked. "You really shouldn't have parked here," he said. Then he turned and walked away as casually as he had come, leaving a heavy sense of unease behind. The man in the Rolls-Royce watched him go, his heart beating faster than usual. He tried to convince himself that it was nothing, that maybe this young man was just rude or bold. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. Over the next few minutes, as he sipped his coffee, he couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. There was something about the young man's eyes, something dangerous and unpredictable. It wasn't just about a car or a casual comment. It felt personal. As he got back into his Rolls-Royce, he checked the mirrors one last time. The young man was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave him. He started the engine, the quiet purr of the car echoing in the empty street. He had no idea that the events about to unfold would change his life forever. What he didn't know was that the young man had already made a plan. He had been waiting for the right moment, studying the Rolls-Royce, and learning its patterns. This wasn't random. It was deliberate. The man in the Rolls-Royce drove off slowly, trying to shake off the feeling of dread. But deep down, he knew he couldn't ignore it. Something was coming. Something he could never have predicted. And just like that, a calm Sunday morning in a quiet neighborhood became the beginning of a story that would shock everyone. The story of a Rolls-Royce, a young man with too much arrogance, and a chain of events that would lead to chaos, danger, and millions in penalties. Little did he know, by the end of the day, he would witness something so shocking that he would never forget it for the rest of his life. Something that would make every caution he ever ignored seem like a mistake. And all it took was one moment, one young man, and one Rolls-Royce. The day had started peacefully, but peace is often the quiet before a storm. Across the street, the young man didn't just leave after his first warning. He lingered, leaning against the black SUV, his eyes fixed on the Rolls-Royce. There was something calculated about him, a patience that was almost scary. He wasn't in a hurry. He was waiting. Watching. Planning. The man in the Rolls-Royce didn't notice him at first. He was distracted by a text on his phone, answering a client's urgent message. But then he saw a flash of movement in the rearview mirror. The young man was walking toward him again, slower this time, like a predator circling its prey. Every step seemed measured, every glance deliberate. When he reached the sidewalk beside the Rolls-Royce, he stopped and smiled, not the friendly kind, but a smirk that made the man behind the wheel uneasy. "Nice car," the young man said, voice calm but full of an edge. "You must really love it." The man smiled politely, but there was tension in his shoulders. "Yes, I do," he said cautiously. "It's special." The young man leaned closer to the car, almost inspecting it. "Special, huh?" he murmured. His eyes moved over the polished surface, the chrome details, the tinted windows. "I wonder how it feels to drive a car like this every day. Must feel like nothing can touch you." There was a pause, and the air between them grew thick. The man in the Rolls-Royce shifted uncomfortably. Something about the way the young man said nothing can touch you didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like a warning. Suddenly, the young man reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. For a moment, it seemed he might be taking a picture of the car. But instead, he pressed a few buttons, pointed it toward the vehicle, and smiled again. "Just keeping a record," he said casually, though his eyes betrayed a different message entirely. The man behind the wheel tried to remain calm. "Listen, I don't know what your problem is, but I'd appreciate it if you didn't cause trouble," he said firmly. The young man laughed softly, a sound that made the hair on the back of the man's neck stand up. "Trouble? Me? No trouble. Just curious." He circled the Rolls-Royce slowly, letting his hand brush against the car's side as if testing it. "Curiosity is dangerous sometimes, don't you think?" The man felt a shiver run through him. He had dealt with difficult people before, but this felt different. This young man wasn't just arrogant, he was bold, reckless, and fearless in a way that was dangerous. "Look," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "I don't want any problems. Just stay away from my car, okay?" The young man paused, looking at him directly. His eyes were sharp, almost daring. "Stay away? Or else?" he asked, his tone playful but with a clear edge. The man swallowed hard. He knew the question wasn't empty. Something told him this wasn't over. The young man was sending a message, a clear one, even if he didn't say it outright. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, the young man stepped back and waved. "See you around," he said with a smirk, turning toward the street as if nothing had happened. But the message was clear, he was watching, waiting, and planning something. The man in the Rolls-Royce stayed frozen for a moment, staring after him. His heart raced, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was already closer than he thought. Every instinct in his body screamed at him, "Don't underestimate this one." He got back into the car slowly, locking the doors. The streets were still quiet, but the tension lingered. The man tried to tell himself it was just a strange encounter, but he knew deep down that something was brewing. Something big. And somewhere down the street, the young man smiled to himself, knowing he had already planted the seed. The game had begun. Little did the man in the Rolls-Royce know, this encounter was not a random act of curiosity. It was the start of a chain of events that would change everything. The calm of the morning had vanished, replaced by anticipation, fear, and the certainty that this young man was not someone to be ignored. The first move had been made. And the next one would be much worse. The calm of the morning had vanished. Even though the streets looked quiet, the air itself seemed heavier, as if the neighborhood knew something was coming. The man in the Rolls-Royce tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to him like a shadow. He drove slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the young man appear again. And then he did. The young man emerged from between two parked cars, walking with a strange kind of patience. There was no hurry in his steps, but each movement seemed deliberate, almost theatrical. He stopped a few yards away and stared at the Rolls-Royce. This time, there was no smile, no playful tone, just eyes that seemed cold, calculating, and full of quiet menace. The man behind the wheel felt a shiver run down his spine. Something about this stare was different from before. Before, it had been arrogance, now, it was a warning. A silent message that said, "I'm going to make you pay attention." The young man reached into his pocket again, but this time not for a phone. Instead, he pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. With a slow, deliberate movement, he tossed it onto the windshield of the Rolls-Royce. The car shook slightly as it landed, the paper flapping in the morning breeze. The man unlocked the doors, got out cautiously, and picked up the note. Written in messy, jagged handwriting were just 3 words. Watch your car. He looked up, but the young man was already walking away, disappearing into the distance as if he had never been there. The message was simple, yet chilling. It was not a joke. It was a promise. For a moment, the man just stood there, gripping the note. His mind raced. He had dealt with rude neighbors, careless teenagers, and even aggressive drivers before. But nothing like this. This was personal. This was targeted. And he knew it. Later that afternoon, he tried to continue with his normal routine, but the feeling of being watched never left him. Every time he parked the Rolls-Royce, every time he turned a corner, he imagined the young man lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment. And then came the next sign. It started small, a scratch on the door of the Rolls-Royce. At first, he thought it was an accident. Maybe someone had brushed against the car in the parking lot. But then he found more scratches, deeper this time, all around the car. Some looked intentional, almost as if someone had been practicing. That's when he realized the truth, this wasn't random. This was deliberate. The young man wasn't just testing him, he was planning something bigger. Something dangerous. The tension grew with every passing hour. The man couldn't sleep. Every sound outside his house made him jump. Every passerby seemed suspicious. He felt trapped, like a target in a game he hadn't agreed to play. And somewhere, the young man was smiling. He was enjoying the fear he had created, the uncertainty he had planted. It wasn't enough to just intimidate, he wanted control. He wanted to make sure the man in the Rolls-Royce knew that he could strike at any moment and that there was nothing anyone could do to stop him. By evening, the man knew he had to act. He called a friend, someone who could watch the car when he wasn't around. He even installed a small security camera on the driveway, hoping it would capture something if the young man tried anything. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be enough. This wasn't just about security, this was about a person who didn't care about rules, laws, or consequences. As night fell, the neighborhood quieted down again. But the man couldn't rest. Every shadow seemed longer, every sound sharper. He felt like the calm before a storm, the kind of storm that could destroy everything he had worked for. And in a dark corner of the street, the young man watched from a distance. His eyes glinted in the faint light, and his mind raced with plans. He wasn't just a reckless kid anymore, he was a force of chaos waiting to strike. He had made his first move, he had sent his warnings, and now he was ready for the next step. The man in the Rolls-Royce didn't know it yet, but the storm was coming. And when it hit, nothing would ever be the same. The night had fallen, but the streets were still alive with the faint glow of streetlights. Shadows stretched across the pavement, and a cold wind whispered through the neighborhood. The man in the Rolls-Royce parked his car carefully in front of his house, feeling a tension he couldn't shake. The note, the scratches, the constant feeling of being watched, it all weighed heavily on him. He locked the doors, double-checked the security cameras, and went inside. Every sound outside made him jump, the rustling of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, even the hum of the streetlights seemed louder than usual. He tried to convince himself he was being paranoid. Maybe the young man had left for the night. Maybe, just maybe, it was over. But it wasn't over. Hours later, long after the man had gone to bed, a faint smell of gasoline drifted through the air. At first, he thought it was his imagination. But then came the flicker of orange light through the curtains. His heart stopped. He ran to the window and froze. Flames were licking the sides of his Rolls-Royce. The polished black surface was reflecting the fire, turning the car into a burning sculpture of metal and glass. He couldn't believe his eyes. How could someone be so reckless, so cruel? He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Fire! My car! Someone set it on fire, he shouted, trying to keep calm, but panic had already taken over. Meanwhile, across the street, the young man watched from the shadows. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He just stood there, a small smirk on his face, as if the fire was a performance he had been waiting for. The orange flames lit up his face in brief bursts, making him look like a figure from a nightmare. The man in the Rolls-Royce ran outside, the heat from the fire hitting him before he even reached the car. Neighbors began to appear, calling out in shock. Someone grabbed a garden hose and tried to douse the flames, but it was too late. The fire was spreading fast, consuming the car with terrifying speed. He tried to do something, anything, but it was useless. He was just one man against a roaring blaze. His beloved Rolls-Royce, the symbol of his hard work and success, was being destroyed in front of him. And all he could do was watch. The sound of sirens grew louder, and soon the fire department arrived. Firefighters jumped into action, spraying water, shouting orders, and trying to control the chaos. The man stood back, shaking, unable to move. His car, his pride, his memories, everything seemed to vanish in smoke. And through it all, the young man slipped away silently, blending into the night like a ghost. No one saw him leave. No one knew who had started the fire. But the message was clear, he had made his move. He had struck, and chaos had followed. The man in the Rolls-Royce couldn't stop staring at the burning wreck. Flames reflected in his eyes, and in that reflection, he saw more than a car destroyed, he saw a warning. A challenge. The young man wasn't finished. Not yet. As the firefighters finally brought the blaze under control, the man stepped closer to what remained of his Rolls-Royce. The smell of smoke, melted metal, and burnt rubber filled the air. The car was ruined. But the danger wasn't over. The young man had proven something. He could take what wasn't his, he could bend fear into action, and he could make people feel powerless. The man knew one thing for certain, this wasn't just vandalism. This was intentional. Personal. And it was only the beginning. As he turned to look down the dark street, he realized the young man had vanished into the shadows. But the threat remained. And the next move, the one that could cost millions, was waiting. The quiet neighborhood was no longer safe. The game had escalated. And by the end of this night, no one would forget the fire, the fear, and the shocking power of one reckless, daring young man. The morning after the fire, the neighborhood was quiet, but the air felt heavy, like everyone was holding their breath. The man in the Rolls-Royce stood on the curb, staring at the burnt shell of his car. Charred metal, melted chrome, and the blackened outline of his beloved vehicle made his heart ache. It wasn't just a car, it was years of work, dreams, and memories gone in a single night. The first to arrive were the police. 2 officers stepped out of their cruiser, notebooks in hand. They looked at the wreckage, then at him. "Can you tell us exactly what happened?" one asked. He tried to explain, but the words caught in his throat. He told them about the young man he had seen lurking around, the note on the windshield, the scratches, everything. The officers exchanged a glance. It was clear this wasn't just an accident. Then the investigators began examining the car, taking photos, fingerprints, and samples. They moved carefully around the burnt metal, looking for anything that could point to the culprit. Every detail mattered. Every clue could bring the person who did this to justice. As the man watched, he felt a mix of anger and fear. He knew exactly who was behind it, but the police didn't. And if they didn't catch him fast, he could strike again or disappear completely. Then came the first break. A neighbor had seen a figure running from the scene just before the fire erupted. The description was vague, but it matched the young man he had encountered for days. The officers scribbled notes, and the man felt a small spark of hope. Maybe there was a chance to stop him. Meanwhile, the man checked his security cameras. One camera on the driveway had captured something important. A shadowy figure had approached the Rolls-Royce before the fire. Though the footage was grainy, the young man's movements were unmistakable. He moved with confidence, like he knew exactly what he was doing. This is it, the man thought. This is proof. The police asked him to provide the video, and he handed it over immediately. He knew it could be dangerous. The young man might realize he had been caught on camera. But there was no other choice. The fire had crossed a line. This wasn't just vandalism anymore, it was a serious crime. Hours later, detectives arrived. They were determined and sharp-eyed, asking the man for every detail about his encounters, the note, the scratches, and the previous warnings. He told them everything, even small details he thought were unimportant. Every piece of information could help them connect the dots. The young man, however, was clever. He had left no fingerprints on the car, no clear evidence that could immediately tie him to the crime. He knew how to stay one step ahead, but he had underestimated one thing: the man in the Rolls-Royce didn't give up easily. He had remembered every movement, every gesture, and every clue the young man had left behind. By the end of the day, the investigators had a list of potential suspects, and the young man's name was at the top. But proving it would take time. In the meantime, the man could only watch and wait, hoping that the young man wouldn't strike again. As the sun set, a new sense of determination settled in him. This was no longer just about a car. It was about justice, about stopping someone who thought they could act without consequences. And somewhere, the young man was likely planning his next move, unaware that the law was closing in. The investigation had begun, and with it, the stakes had grown higher. Every detail mattered. Every witness, every piece of evidence, every camera footage could be the key to catching him. The calm neighborhood was now a chessboard, and both players knew the game had just turned deadly serious. And the man in the Rolls-Royce realized one terrifying truth: the fire was only the beginning. The investigation had barely begun when the man in the Rolls-Royce received the first official letter from federal authorities. He read it slowly, each word sinking like a stone into his stomach. It wasn't just a warning or a local police notice. This was serious enough to shake anyone to the core. The letter detailed the charges: arson, destruction of property, reckless endangerment, and the penalties were staggering. The young man, the Karen's son, was now facing $10 million in federal fines if convicted. The magnitude of it all made the man feel a mix of relief and disbelief. Relief that justice was finally moving, disbelief that someone could be so reckless, so entitled, that their actions could spiral into this level of consequences. The news spread fast in the neighborhood. People whispered about the fire, the investigation, and now the federal charges. Some were shocked, others intrigued. No one had ever imagined that a fire in a quiet street could lead to such high stakes. Meanwhile, the young man remained defiant. He didn't look scared, didn't show regret. To him, the attention, the fines, even the legal actions were just another challenge. He moved as if untouchable, confident that he could find a way out. But he underestimated one thing: federal investigations are meticulous. Every move, every text, every interaction could be traced. Every mistake, no matter how small, could cost him dearly. The man in the Rolls-Royce, however, didn't feel victorious yet. Seeing the consequences on paper wasn't the same as feeling safe. The scars of the fire, the memory of the flames, and the fear that had gripped him would not vanish overnight. He had learned that some people don't respect boundaries, laws, or decency. And sometimes, it takes more than hope, it takes evidence, patience, and courage to make sure justice is served. Federal agents began interviewing neighbors, witnesses, and anyone who might have information about the young man. They tracked phone records, examined surveillance footage, and analyzed the burnt Rolls-Royce for forensic clues. The investigation was no longer local, it had escalated to a level the young man hadn't anticipated. And then came the tipping point. The man in the Rolls-Royce received a call from the federal investigators. They had found enough evidence to charge the young man formally. The $10 million figure wasn't just a number, it was the consequence of years of recklessness and entitlement, the cost of thinking one could act above the law. The man felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, yes, but also a sobering realization that life could change in a matter of minutes. One careless act, one reckless decision, one fire, and now millions of dollars, legal battles, and federal penalties were in motion. The young man's world had shifted dramatically, though he refused to show it. Friends whispered behind his back, family argued quietly in the background, and the weight of federal charges began to press down on him. He wasn't just a teenager acting out anymore, he was facing the full force of the law. For the man in the Rolls-Royce, life slowly started to feel normal again. He could breathe a little easier, though the scars of the fire remained, both on his car and in his mind. Justice was moving forward, and the young man would finally have to answer for his actions. Yet, one thing was clear, the incident had changed everyone involved. The quiet neighborhood, the man's sense of safety, and even the young man's arrogance, it was all gone. Replaced by a hard lesson, actions have consequences, and sometimes, the price is higher than anyone could imagine. As the sun set over the neighborhood, the man looked at what remained of his Rolls-Royce, reflecting on the chaos, the fear, and the law that had finally stepped in. The fire, the threats, the investigation, they had all led to this moment. And one truth remained unshakable: no one, no matter how entitled, is above the law. The fire was out. The investigation was over, or at least far enough along that the man in the Rolls-Royce could finally breathe. The neighborhood had returned to a quiet rhythm, but nothing would ever feel the same again. The smell of smoke lingered faintly in the air, a reminder of the chaos that had struck without warning. The man walked slowly around what remained of his car. Charred metal glinted under the sun, warped and scarred by the flames. He traced his fingers over the edges, feeling both sadness and relief. Sadness for what had been lost, relief that no one had been hurt, and a strange sense of justice knowing that the young man responsible was finally facing the consequences of his reckless actions. It had been a long journey from the first encounter to this point. From the casual smirk across the street to the note on the windshield, to the fire that had engulfed his Rolls-Royce, every moment had tested him. Every step had required patience, courage, and the determination not to let fear control him. The legal system had stepped in. The young man, once full of arrogance and entitlement, now faced the weight of federal consequences. The $10 million penalty loomed over him, a clear reminder that actions, especially dangerous, destructive ones, always have repercussions. For the man in the Rolls-Royce, there was a lesson that went beyond the car, beyond the fire, and beyond the fear. People who think the world owes them something will eventually learn that choices have costs. Sometimes, those costs are small. Sometimes, they are life-changing. He looked up at the quiet street, now empty and peaceful, and realized he had grown stronger through the ordeal. Fear had tried to take hold, but he had stayed vigilant. Panic had tried to control him, but he had acted with caution and logic. The fire had tested his patience, his courage, and his ability to face someone who refused to respect boundaries. And yet, there was a small, almost ironic comfort in knowing that justice had been served. Not through vengeance, but through law, through careful investigation, and through patience. The young man's recklessness had caught up with him, and the balance had been restored. As the man walked back into his house, he reflected on the entire ordeal. He understood now that life was unpredictable, that danger could appear in the most ordinary places, and that people could act without thinking. But he also knew something else: courage, vigilance, and standing firm in the face of recklessness could change outcomes. He smiled faintly, thinking about what the future might hold. His car would eventually be repaired, but the lessons he had learned would stay with him forever. Some people seek chaos, but others, through patience and persistence, can turn chaos into justice. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, he made a quiet promise to himself: Never again would he underestimate the danger of someone who thinks rules don't apply to them, but also, never again would he underestimate his own strength to face it. The fire, the threats, the investigation, and the consequences were over, but the story would linger in memory, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, justice can prevail, and actions, no matter how bold or reckless, always have a price.